Hello, everyone, again. Thank you for joining us in the 10-minute Bible lesson. You know that we've been looking at lessons about the parables of Jesus, and we've got another one today. And the title of this parable is A Friend at Midnight. That sounds kind of funny, don't it? Have you ever had a friend come to you at midnight? Well, this is found in the book of Luke chapter 11, and we're going to begin with verses 5 and 6, and let's just see what it says. So it says, "And he said to them, Which of you shall have a friend and go to him at midnight?" There it is. And then he says, "And say to him, Friend, lend me 3 loaves, for a friend of mine has come to me on his journey, and I have nothing to set before him." So this is another parable, and this another parable about prayer. Now, I haven't really read all of the verses, but I think you'll see when I get into it that it's a parable about our attitude toward prayer. That is to say, how we should pray. And I think that's really, really important. So you've heard of the old saying, "A friend in need is a friend indeed." And I think most of us have accepted that maxim as a truth. But it's kind of interesting that in this parable, it doesn't seem to apply. In other words, in this parable, Jesus says something different than that. And so I just thought that was something that was interesting that you might want to watch for as we talk about it. Now, there's a fellow who writes a Bible theologian named William Barclay, and he had something that he said about prayer, and I want to read it to you. I think it's really, really good. And so he starts out and he says, prayer begins with a sense of need. Do you believe that's true? I believe it is true. I think that the reason you go to God in prayer is because you have a need. And that's what he said. And then he goes on to say this, prayer begins with a sense of need. And then he says it begins with the conviction that we cannot deal with life ourselves. Now that almost maybe seemed like an insult to you if somebody says, "What's wrong? You can't deal with life yourself?" The truth of the matter is we can't, because life oftentimes is too big for us. It's just overwhelming to us. So he says this, he says it begins with a conviction that we cannot deal with life ourselves. That sense of human weakness is the basis of all approach to God. And I believe that's so true. So this man Jesus speaks of had a need. And here was his need. He had a friend that had shown up at his house unexpectedly and unannounced. And so I'm just thinking that he didn't let him know. And so that presented a need for him because he didn't have anything to feed him with. And so, he was kind of in a quandary. What was he going to do? Well, this is what he did. He went to another friend, and he went to that friend at midnight. And he asked that friend for loaves of bread so that he could give the friend that was on his journey to come to him so he could feed him. Now, hospitality in the Middle East during this time and this culture was really, really important. In fact, it could determine the kind of person you were. So it was an important thing that he be able to take care of, that he be a good host and take care of his friend and his guests that came to see him. Well, let's go on and read in verse 7 what Jesus says. He says, "And he will answer from within and say, Do not trouble me. The door is now shut, and my children are with me in bed. I cannot rise and give to you." Now this man said that his friend was troubling him. Do you believe that's true? Well, I believe it was, because he came to him at midnight. I don't know about you. Now, I know that the cultures are different than our days, but if somebody came to my house at midnight, I don't know. I don't think it'd be a friend. It could be, but this is what was the case here. So anyway, I think that's interesting. Now he goes on to say this. He said that he refused him. He said, listen, you're troubling me, and we're not going to help you. We're not going to help you at all. And because we're all in bed now. Even though this guy was his friend, he told him, he said, friend, I'm paraphrasing, friend or no friend, we're not going to help you. We're not going to get up and give you anything. And so it was just too much trouble for him. But let's look and see what Jesus says in verse 8. Now remember, the parable's about prayer, about our attitude toward prayer. So in verse 8, it's kind of like a key verse. It goes on, Luke 11:8. He says, I say to you, though he will not rise and give to him because he is his friend. Did you get that? Jesus says this, he will not rise and take care of him based on his friendship. But then he says this, he says, yet because of his persistence, he will rise and give him as many as he needs. So it sounds like to me that persistence it seems like persistence avails more than friendship, or it does at least here. And I think that the teaching here is that we should be persistent in our prayer. And I have to ask you and ask myself, are we persistent in our prayer? And I think that's an interesting thing. Now, it says here that he will give him as many loaves as he needs. Now, in the King James Version, the translation here for persistence is importunity. Importunity. And the Greek meaning, according to Vine's Bible Dictionary, means this. It means shameless persistence. Could you just think about that a minute? Because we're talking about a certain attitude that we should have in our prayer life. So we should have shameless persistence in our prayer life. So the man, in order to get his need met, he had to exercise boldness and persistence in his request. And so we have to think about what Jesus teaches about God, our Father. Of course, he loves us and he cares about us, and he knows our needs and he knows all of our concerns, and he's listening to us. But I think that sometimes God wants us to be persistent in our prayers. That is to say, not to give up. Now, Jesus said this. He says, ask and you'll receive. He said, seek and you'll find. And then he said, knock and the door will be open. Now, to me, that tells me you have to be persistent in your prayer. And it's what we are a lot of times when we don't get an answer right away. We go up, I guess God's not going to answer it. Well, that's not necessarily the case. So we need to have confidence in our prayer life and not give up. Now, I want to close by another verse from another book. This is the book of Hebrews, and it's chapter 4, verse 16. This is what he says, the writer of the Hebrews. He says, let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Listen, we all have needs, and life is too big for us often, and we need to have a great God that loves us and cares for us, and we can bring those needs to him. And one of the ways we can do that is to be persistent in our prayers. Hey, listen, I think it's an excellent thought, and it has to be an excellent parable because Jesus told it. Well, that's all we have today. We appreciate you tuning in and hope you'll join us for another parable next time.